Unit 2. And so I asked you last night, I said, go and take the Unit 2 practice test on AP Classroom, just kind of review all those different topics that are associated with Unit 2 and their question bank. And then what I was going to do is ask you to submit to me 3 things that you want me to review. Now, the problem is you guys have submitted to me a lot of different topics to review. It pretty much covers the entire chapter. So I'm not going to go in any particular order, but I'm going to try my best to kind of scroll through these different things. So please bear with me as I go through this, and hopefully we don't have any major snafus. So let's open up a whiteboard. If there is something that I'm reviewing that you're like, hey, I'd really like to go over that in a little bit more detail, and you kind of just brush it off really quick, pause me right away. Speak out and let me know that you have some questions about it, and I will gladly do what I can there. So any questions about that? Alrighty. So I'm going to get started. I will try my best to kind of engage you guys with some questions here and there. So all I ask that you please, do your best to answer when I ask you questions and stuff like that, so that we can get through some things. Whoop, did my camera just reset? It looks like my camera reset. Let me turn it back on. I don't know. It's been doing this recently today, but all right, here we go. First topic of the discussion for today was the idea of de-extinction. Now, I could spend forever talking about de-extinction, but I am not going to do that today. I'm going to kind of breeze through it, because here's the big thing about de-extinction is it's not really going to be on our test, but it's the idea that you have an organism. Let's just say I draw a little block here, and for some reason it goes extinct. And that's what my X is going to represent. Well, we know that that organism is made up of cells, and inside those cells you will find deoxyribonucleic acid, and that DNA is then able to be, in theory, taken. You can take a small little sample. We run it through a process called PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. It's pretty much like a photocopier for DNA. And somehow we figured out how to photocopy DNA or replicate DNA in a rapid manner. Then what we do is we have a lot of DNA. What we can, in theory, do is take a cell, find the nucleus, replace it with the DNA, and then implant that cell into, some organism, host organism. Sorry, I'm just drawing my mother here. All right, you put it into the womb there, and then in theory, it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, and eventually out pops an organism. Now, that is, in theory, de-extinction. This is if this organism has died. Now, what we have done with a lot of these organisms that are going endangered is we're taking a small little sample of their body tissue, or what we call their somatic cells. And what we are then doing is we are able to store it cryogenically. So they freeze it really cold, and stores the DNA intact, and it doesn't break apart. And that is how de-extinction would work. Now, more people keep coming in, so I'm sorry. Another way people think of de-extinction is the idea of dinosaurs, and can we bring back dinosaurs? Well, here's the problem, is that every now and then we can get DNA from like a dinosaur. Now, the likelihood of us getting it from like first off, a fossil you can't get DNA from, that's just a rock. But you would need some sort of preserved body tissue, which is almost impossible for us to find for most dinosaurs. The idea of Jurassic Park and the mosquito trapped in amber is science fiction, but in theory it could be found. But the DNA for these ancient organisms is broken into fragments, so it's really not able to be combined back together. But what we do know is that organisms that, like the dinosaurs, for example, the genes, the section of their DNA is found in a lot of present-day organisms. So could we, in theory, genetically engineer a genome of an organism, and with that genome of that organism, then figure it out what it could look like and genetically engineer an offspring? Yes, we absolutely could. Is it science fiction? More likely than not, but is it something that could, in theory, happen in the long run? Yeah, maybe. One of the other things that we talk about de-extinction is really a last-ditch effort. should we worry about species going extinct because we know that we can bring them back? Yeah, we should still worry about species going extinct. Part of the problem with de-extinction is it doesn't address the actual root of the problem as to why the species is going extinct, whether it be habitat destruction, whether it be lack of food, lack of excess predation, invasive species, all those different things. All of those things could contribute to the species going extinct, endangered or extinct, and therefore de-extinction is not solving them by bringing that organism back. All right, makes sense on that? Okay. I don't really see your faces, so those of you that might be like shaking your head up and down, all I see are your names. So I'm going to hope that you guys are understanding. If you want to turn your cameras on, you're more than welcome to. It makes it a little bit less awkward for me. Next topic. Punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. And these talk about evolution. So we're really talking about with evolution now. The big theory is gradualism, in that over time, there's small incremental changes that lead to different species and the creation of a species. Anyone know the term given for the creation of a species? What's the process by which a new species appears? Anyone know? Speciation. So it's called speciation when we create a new species. But gradualism says that over time, there's going to be small incremental changes, and eventually we are left with two distinctly different populations. Now, compare that to punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium says that we're going to have minimal changes, but every now and then there's a major change. And so instead of being small incremental changes, it's going to be one major mutation. And that major mutation will lead to our two different species on the planet. Now, here's the thing. We don't know. We don't know which one per se is actually happening. That's why they're both theories on evolution, because they take so much time. Have we seen small little changes happening? Yes, we have. Have we seen major mutations happening? Kind of, yeah, we have. Now, do we know if it leads to new species on the planet? No, we don't. And that's part of the problem. So that's where this punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism debate kind of comes back and forth. What is my personal opinion? I think it's actually a combination of both. I can definitely see why punctuated equilibrium, an organism all of a sudden is born with a really unique mutation that allows it to be advantageous and it's able to survive under certain conditions. And eventually, it's so phenotypically different, it starts to form its own population within itself. And then all of a sudden, they're completely separate populations. They no longer breed. Now you get a new species. I could see that. Could I also see how gradualism can create two different species? Absolutely. Small incremental changes that over time, maybe a slow lengthening of a beak or a neck or something like that creates a different organism. So I could see both. I don't really have one preference over the other as far as my predominant theory on evolution. Next. A lot of people had questions about primary succession, so I want to kind of quickly go over them here. Now, when we see succession, oftentimes we talk about it kind of like a graph. And so we have time along our bottom here. And so time is increasing with this direction. Now, when we talk about primary succession, all right, one of the first things we want to talk about is roughly stages that occur. And first, actually, let me go through this. What are some things that can lead to primary succession? What are some things that can lead to primary succession taking place? What would lead to primary succession? Don't all talk at once, guys. It's okay. What is something that would lead to Natural disruptions, yes, but you got to be more specific. Like, what is a specific disruption to an ecosystem that will lead to primary succession taking place?
Volcano eruption.
Very good. So volcanoes. So volcanoes are absolutely, they're going to leave magma, which is going to harden into rock, no soil. Absolutely. Glaciers. Glaciers will strip the soil. They scrape the soil off and lead to just bedrock behind. And then the third option or third thing I'm just going to kind of quickly mention would be like roads or pavement. So roads or pavement, all of those things are going to lead to no soil. That's the big thing about primary succession. There's no soil. So when we talk about primary succession, we have to start to form soil. So how do we form soil? Through the process of weathering. And you guys are going to learn about weathering in Unit 4. But what it is it's just the breakdown of the parent material into small particles, sand-sized particles or even smaller. Then what's going to happen is you're going to get your first organisms to start to colonize these areas. So maybe we have, for example, like a large rock here, all right? And it's slowly breaking off, making smaller and smaller pieces that could lead to the abiotic components of soil. But what now is going to colonize? What is going to be the first organisms to colonize in primary succession? What's the classification of organisms called that colonize first?
Is it the pioneer species?
Very good. Pioneer species. Now, pioneer species are going to start to come in first. Now, what is the most famous pioneer species? We have them growing all over rocks and trees around here. Not moss. Shannon's right. Lichen. All right. So lichen, L-I-C-H. It's actually a symbiotic relationship between fungus and algae. So what happens is it actually lives on the rock and it will slowly degrade it away. But now what it is, it's organic matter. And what's going to happen is as things are weathered, as the wind blows, more particles are going to kind of stick together. And eventually it's going to build up this mat. So that organic matter area is going to start to accumulate and get more and more and more. And then it's going to lead to our vegetation. So we're going to finally leave the lichen are considered to be fungus, but then we're going to get to our first plants. All right, now we have soil. So soil is formed. So now we get our first basic plants. What's the most basic type of plant we have? The simplest type of plant. It has no vascular system. What's our simplest type of plant? Mosses. So moss comes in now. So moss starts to grow, and then eventually it will lead to grasses. So grasses will then eventually form, shrubs, and then eventually trees. Now, when we form our trees, if you got to think about it, moss is low to the ground, grass is a little bit taller, shrubs a little bit taller, and then our first trees are going to emerge above here. Now, the first trees are going, there's two real types of trees. You can have sun-loving trees, or you can have shade-tolerant trees. There's certain trees that need a lot of sun to grow. There are early successional trees because you need the sun first. And then what's going to happen is in order for a tree now to start to grow, once you have these trees established, it has to be able to tolerate the shade. And like you guys were doing with your labs, you guys noticed a lot of the sugar maples in Idlewood. You guys were saying you couldn't identify them as maples because they didn't have the samaras on them. Well, what was happening is they're not getting enough light to produce their reproductive parts, which are the samaras or the little helicopter things. but they are growing. They're getting bigger and bigger, and so they're actually shade-tolerant trees that are starting to take over and will eventually crowd out those initial sun-loving trees. All right, any questions about that? Let me see, do I have all the stuff about succession? Yeah. All righty, next. Specialist versus generalist. I'm going to go through this really, really quickly because you guys are going to learn about it a lot more in Unit 3. The idea of a specialist, it has a narrow niche, and the generalist has a broad niche. Now, narrow means it's very specific to its food, it's specific to its habitat, it's specific to climatic conditions, all of those things. Oftentimes, these are the type of species that can go endangered. Meanwhile, generalist species often can become invasive. Here's why. When we look at our generalist, they have a broad niche. They can survive in a lot of different habitats. They eat a lot of different foods. So when they're introduced to a new area, they can survive. They do really well. Compare that with a specialist species. A specialist species will not naturally go endangered. Well, I shouldn't say that. I take that back. Organisms do die off. They do go endangered, usually due to competition. But the one thing I want you to understand is that human actions and human habitat degradation, especially when you have a narrow niche, leads to endangerment far faster than anything else. If you only eat a specific type of food, or if you only live in a certain area, and that area is polluted, or that area is damaged by human development, now all of a sudden you're less likely to survive. All right, and you think about some of our specialist species could be very small, like a specific salamander that lives in specific climatic conditions, and they're very likely to go extinct if those conditions aren't met. All right, does that make sense about the specialist generalist? Those of you that might have had questions about that? All right, I'm going to keep moving on. All right, let's see what's next here. Genetic bottleneck. A genetic bottleneck is what happens when you have a large breeding population. So hypothetically, let me take a look at this. And this is a large breeding population. All the genetic combinations are called the gene pool. So you have the gene pool. Let me throw some different colors in here. So yeah, let me just represent all these little lines. Well, let's say they're chromosomes or something like that. I don't know. And one more color for good luck. So here's my genetic combinations. Now, something is going to happen to the population of organisms. Something happens, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a disease, it could be something. Climatic conditions change, who knows? But what is going to happen is that entire breeding population is going to be shrunk down. And let's say, hypothetically, only a few organisms survive. Now, what happens from that bottleneck and that small group of organisms that survive, the remainder of the population is going to be built. Now, here's the question. Because of this bottleneck right here, does the remaining population, the new population over here, does it have the same ratio of genetic information as the initial population? No, it does not. What has happened is the genetic information has been bottlenecked. Now, it is going to drop the biodiversity, and it actually leads to a very dangerous situation for this population because they are very, very vulnerable because they're all very genetically similar. So if a disease were to come through or something like that were to come through, it could wipe them all out because they all have pretty much the same genome. Now, where have we seen this happen? Okay, we've actually seen this with cheetahs. And we've actually seen it with a lot of different organisms, but cheetahs are one of the most famous ones, in that, of the 5 to 10,000 cheetahs on the planet today, they can actually trace them back like 1,000, 2,000 years. There were only like 5 total individuals left on the planet. I don't know the reason why, but and all the subsequent organisms were offspring of them. So it's a lot of inbreeding, but what that has done is that has created a very, very low genetic diversity. So far, so good on the genetic bottleneck. I hope so. Someone asked for the effects of natural disruptions. Now, this is an interesting one. Like, again, I could talk for a long while on the effect of natural disruptions, but let's think. If things are natural, what that means is that organisms have adapted to those. So if it's natural, it means it commonly occurs. And I don't mean like every year type of disaster occur or disruption occur, but it's common. Like, think of like the fires in California. Right now, it's almost common like, every year, but it's not the same areas burning. It's different areas burning. But what happens is the organisms are adapted to those disruptions. So sometimes they need those disruptions in order to reproduce. Sometimes they need them in order to survive. It kills off the invasive species, which are not used to those conditions. One of the things we can talk about, especially like out west, a lot of the specific types of pine trees, they require a lot of heat to open up their pine cones and to drop their seeds. This also helps to control the invasive species that are trying to colonize the area. And therefore, it's only your native plants that are surviving those areas. So we can talk about things like droughts that's commonly occurring. Now, again, this is not every year this happens, but this happens in a certain cyclical pattern. Remember, there's different types of frequencies. We could talk about episodic, periodic, or random. Like every spring we have a flooding, that's episodic. If, once every so many thousand years, that's periodic. Random is like, oh yeah, we had an ice age here, and then, some other odd interval, we had another ice age, and then some other odd interval, we had another ice age, but you can't predict or even attempt to plan for randomized frequency of things. All right. Next topic. Invasive species. When we talk about invasive species, these are species that are non-native. They've been released in a new habitat and they've been able to colonize. Now, why are they able to colonize? Oftentimes because they don't have any predators, but they're able to survive. Now, most of our invasive species, where do they come from? Where do most of the invasive species that we have in the United States, in our area specifically, where do they come from? Very good, Maddie. They're coming from Asia. Now, why are they coming from Asia? Why are a lot of the invasive species that we're experiencing in our area, why are they coming from Asia? Trade, maybe, maybe not. Think, for example, can anything grow here? If I just went out to the courtyard and planted any type of plant I wanted, would it grow? Very good, Maddie. It's dealing with their ecosystems, not just the ecosystem, but let's go back to like Unit 1 and some of the terminology we talked about. The idea of similar climate and more specifically, biomes. So the organisms we have that are taking over our ecosystem are coming from a very similar climate or a similar biome over in Asia. Think about this. Does anyone know what Tokyo is really famous for in the spring? Or Japan, a lot of what goes on in the spring in Japan. Does anyone know what goes over there? Natural event that happens? Good, Dan. It's the cherry blossoms. You know what Washington, D.C. is really famous for in the spring? cherry blossoms. All right. So the cherry blossom and the cherry trees, they blossom roughly the same time of year. And that's, because we have very, very similar climatic conditions. Now, when we talk about invasive species, there's a couple big major ones that you should know about. The Burmese python, kudzu vine, Asian carp, lionfish. I'm trying to think of any other big ones. Those are some of the major ones that you should know about, because these can appear on national exams. The Burmese python is probably one of the most famous invasive species in the United States, destroying the Florida Everglades. What happened is people buy these snakes when they're really, really small, but they just feed them and feed them and feed them, and they continue to grow and grow and grow and grow, and then eventually they release them because they're like, oh, I can't keep it anymore. When you buy it, it's a foot long, people tolerate it. When it becomes a 6 foot long snake, people don't really know what to do with it, so they just release it. And then it becomes up to an 18 or 19 foot long snake, and it's just freaky to think about. Where were we next? When we talk about invasive species, some people talk about an invasive species curve. The invasive species curve looks like this, and it's got a couple simple axes. Over on here, all the way on the right, is the cost. So how expensive is it to remove or control? And this is time down here. And then this line right here is the population. So what you can see is that when the population is, when the population is really low, it's really cheap to remove. But as the population grows, because we haven't done anything, now all of a sudden the cost increases. And eventually it gets up to the point where it becomes extremely expensive, if not impossible, to eradicate a species. So where are we at with the spotted lanternfly? Well, it was probably introduced around, 2014, something like that, or we started to detect it. And then what has happened is the population has continued to grow. Now, where are we on this invasive species curve with these spotted lanternfly? Maybe somewhere about here, which is kind of scary to think about, because that means the population is going to get far greater. Think of it like this. A single spotted lanternfly can lay somewhere between 50 to 100 eggs a season. So if you have 1,000 spotted lanternflies, which I'm pretty sure we have well over that, but it means next year you'll have 50 to 100,000 spotted lanternflies, right? So if we have 250,000 in our area now, we could have 25 million of them next year. It's crazy to think about, but if you think about how fast that population can grow, think about a population growing at a 30 to 100 times rate of population growth. Absolutely crazy. Alrighty, moving on. Ecological tolerance, or does that help? Does that clarify a lot of the invasive species stuff? Alrighty. Ecological tolerance. Ecological tolerance is a cool little topic. What it's saying is that along this axis here, you have comfort levels of their habitat and the niche and the resources. And you have a prime location, a good location where you want to be. And now what happens is there's a bell curve kind of formed. Now assume that bell curve peaks right over top of that, ideal zone. Now what's actually happening here is that we can identify this range in the middle. This is in the middle is where all your needs are being met. Because what's happening is you've got plenty of food, you've got resources, you've got mates, and because of all this stuff, you have energy. And therefore, reproduction will go way up. So the organisms will start to reproduce because you have all the criteria you need to survive. Now, if we look outside of this area here, so this is like the sweet spot. It's where organisms want to exist. This is like the fringe. And they can survive here. You know, we go back to talking about those maple trees growing in Idlewood. They're not reproducing, but they're still growing. They're still surviving. They're still doing fine. They don't have absolutely perfect conditions, but they've got enough that they can continue to grow. And then you get this outermost area where organisms can live, but really all they're doing is they're surviving. They're not really growing. They're definitely not reproducing. They're spending all their energy on just surviving. So they're going to grow really, really slowly. They're not going to reproduce. They're going to just kind of get by. And that is the edge of their ecological tolerance. Now, they want to be in this area, right? They want to be in the smack in the center, but they can tolerate living in all of these other conditions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to reproduce and their population is going to grow. Does that clear up the idea of ecological tolerance? All right, I've got about 10 more minutes. Oh, looks like my camera's shutting off again. I don't know why my camera keeps doing that, but all right. Someone asked for humans and biodiversity and the relationship between humans and biodiversity. I don't really know what you were looking for here, but here's the one thing I can say. Humans rarely, if ever, increase the biodiversity of an area. The only time I could maybe think about it would be, and the thing is, I really want you to understand this, it's with probably like very, very specific reintroduction processes, like especially the reintroduction of keystone species. Like when we talk about wolves in Yellowstone, by reintroducing the wolves, like, yes, that introducing one organism technically probably raised the biodiversity value, but that's not really what we're looking at. But the idea that, you know, it helped to restore the ecosystem and therefore it's helping organisms to survive. That is not necessarily always the case, though. Most times when we talk about humans and biodiversity, humans are destroying biodiversity values. We are lowering biodiversity values. We are not increasing them. It's usually due to the HIPCO, the idea of habitat destruction, invasive species, overpopulation, overconsumption of resources, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. So those are the things that are really leading to degradation of biodiversity. So does that make sense? I don't know who had specifically asked for that, humans and biodiversity, but I'm hoping that kind of clears up some of the things. If you have a specific topic you wanted me to review on that, feel free to shoot me an email. I will gladly address it. All right, endangered species. Remember, there's two major legislations that address endangered species. What are the two major legislations that address endangered species? What are the two major legislations or laws that address endangered species? What is the most famous one? Very good, Maddie. The ESA, which is the Endangered Species Act. Now, the thing about the Endangered Species Act, and we need to make sure we know, it's the U.S. only. It only is enforced by the United States, and it has two criteria. You're either endangered or you are threatened. Now, this is controversial because certain organisms that their populations are increasing, but they're still listed on the Endangered Species Act. And it's also very costly to some property owners in the area. Does anyone know what the international legislation addressing endangered species is? called CITES. CITES is the Conservation on International Trade in Endangered Species, and it's run by the IUCN, and what they do is they produce something called the Red List. And the Red List is designed to identify species and the levels of endangerment. Now, the Red List is far more specific, or has far more criteria. It goes from least concern to vulnerable to then endangered to critically endangered to extinct in the wild to eventually extinct. And they evaluate many, many different organisms. This is international law, and it's designed to help to protect organisms that are endangered so that they are not illegally trafficked or illegally harvested and various things like that. Next, HIPCO. HIPCO is an acronym. It's an acronym we use to identify threats to species. It stands for Habitat Degradation.
Mr. Maloney,
Yes.
for the Red List thing, what were the last 2 points after the critically endangered?
That was extinct in the wild and extinct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. So back to HIPCO. Habitat degradation is the #1 cause of species going endangered. We are destroying habitats all over the world, so it's very, very dangerous. The I stands for invasive species. I'm just going to write invasives. P stands for pollution. The other P stands for population, referring to human population. And the overconsumption of resources. C is climate change. The O is overexploitation. Remember when we talked about the idea of tragedy of the commons and the overharvesting of things. Again, the H is by far the most destructive to, or the greatest threat to endangered species, or to species going endangered. It's really poorly worded on my end. So habitat degradation is the #1 cause of species going endangered. So that's why I wanted you to make sure that you know that. All right, I only got a couple more minutes, so let me quickly go through. Next, island biogeography. I was really surprised you guys asked me to go through island biogeography again because we did a lab on it. But remember, there's 2 major criteria. It's the size of the island, and it's also the distance of the island from the mainland. And what we're saying, as the size goes up, the colonization rate goes up. As the distance goes up, the colonization rate goes down. And so what we're saying here is we're really looking at the relationship between size and distance, and that will tell you how likely an organism or how many organisms is likely to colonize an area. Right? Does that make sense of that? This is, again, when we threw the Skittles, small island far away had a lower colonization rate than a large island closer. Moving on. Habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation is when you take a large habitat and maybe I'm going to build a road through here. So what I've done is I've now split this. All right. Now, by splitting this, what I've done is I've taken this border area. This border area is commonly referred to as the edge. And what I've done now is I've increased the amount of edge habitat, because now there's all this extra border on the center, right? And that's extremely important because edge really opens up the avenue for invasive species. And why does the edge allow invasive species to come in? It's because it's kind of protected by forest, assuming this was forest here. And this is going to be forest here as well. But you're protected in that you have the big trees kind of shielding you, but you're getting a lot of sunlight now. And by increasing the amount of sunlight you get, you can experience more and more rapid growth. So invasive species often really take root along the edge. If you think about Idlewood, as you work your way around the perimeter of Idlewood, you're not really able to see into the woods. Yet when we were in the woods, we could actually see, I could stand in one spot, I could see all my lab groups working. That's because all the shade from inside the trees is really shading out a lot of the invasive species from growing. So that's how that is protecting different things from there. The other thing that really happens when we talk about habitat fragmentation is you might have an organism that has a very, very large range, maybe a gray wolf pack or something like that. And that won't fit in this new fragmented habitat, so therefore they won't exist in here. So what you're really doing is you're driving a lot of your species out because they can't live in this area anymore. Good? Next. Aquatic hitchhikers. The idea that, if I got my little boat here, right, my little boat's got an engine, the engine's got a propeller, whatnot, sits on a trailer, right? This boat could have little pieces of algae, or the trailer could have pieces of algae all attached to it when I pull that boat out. Now, if I drive to a new pond and I put the boat back in the pond, this little piece of algae can find its way into that body of water. And so this piece of algae could be an invasive species that I am now transporting from one place to the next. All right, so that is a big problem with aquatic hitchhikers. They're just things that aren't cleaned up. And the thing also happens with large shipping boats when they flood their ballast tanks to hold extra water. All right, last topic. I don't know if I'm going to have time to fully complete it. The idea of evolution. When the planet was first formed 4.6 billion years ago, it was missing some major things from the atmosphere. It didn't have oxygen and it didn't have ozone. Right? So because we didn't have oxygen, we didn't have ozone, we couldn't really develop on land. You had to develop in the water because you had to be protected from the ultraviolet radiation coming in. So what organisms eventually created the oxygen we have in the atmosphere? What organisms created the oxygen we have in the atmosphere? Cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. All right. So please make sure you guys read up on that, read up on how those all worked out. I'm going to kind of pause right now from reviewing